The light that changed everything. July 16th, 1945. 5:29 in the morning, 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico. Dr. Kenneth Bainbridge, professor of physics at Harvard University and director of the Trinity test, stood in the concrete bunker 16 kilometers from ground zero, his hands trembling as he held the telephone receiver. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he had just witnessed a light brighter than 1,000 suns, and his first coherent thought was impossibly simple. We've made a terrible mistake. The shock wave hadn't even reached him yet, traveling at the speed of sound across the desert floor. But already he understood that the world would never be the same. What Bainbridge didn't know was that the weapon he had just helped test had performed almost exactly as predicted by one physicist, while simultaneously exceeding the worst nightmares of those who had warned against its creation, and that the gap between human understanding and human capability had just become an unbridgeable chasm. The mathematics were staggering. Some of the Manhattan Project's most brilliant minds had predicted the device would produce no energy at all, a complete failure of the implosion mechanism. Others had calculated yields ranging from 0 to 18 kilotons of TNT equivalent. One group, led by Edward Teller, had seriously entertained the possibility that the explosion would ignite the Earth's atmosphere in a runaway fusion reaction, incinerating every living thing on the planet's surface in a matter of seconds. Physicist I.I. Rabi had predicted 18 kilotons. The actual yield would be measured at approximately 20 kilotons. But these numbers, spelled out as words in reports and calculations, could not capture the absolute transformation of matter into energy that had just occurred. The conversion of 6.2 kilograms of plutonium into the explosive equivalent of 40 million pounds of TNT, releasing in a fraction of a second more energy than a major city consumed in a day. The scale was unprecedented in human history. A single bomb, weighing roughly 10,000 pounds, had just demonstrated destructive power equivalent to 2,000 fully loaded B-29 bombers, each carrying 10,000 pounds of conventional explosives. The firebomb raids on Tokyo 3 months earlier had required 334 aircraft flying for hours to achieve their horrific effect. This single device had compressed that destructive potential into a sphere of plutonium the size of a grapefruit, and released it in less than 1/1,000,000th of a second. Every observer who witnessed the test understood immediately that warfare itself had fundamentally changed. The industrial age calculus of men, machines, and munitions had been rendered obsolete in a single blinding flash. The transformation was absolute. At 5:29 and 45 seconds that morning, human civilization possessed weapons that could destroy cities given enough aircraft, enough bombs, enough time. At 5:29 and 46 seconds, humanity possessed a weapon that could destroy a city in an instant, could be delivered by a single aircraft, and against which there was no defense. The 1-second gap between those two states of reality would define the remainder of the 20th century and cast its shadow over every century to come. The path to Trinity. The road to that July morning had begun not in the New Mexico desert, but in laboratories and lecture halls across the world, as physicists gradually unlocked the secrets of the atomic nucleus. In 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms that released tremendous energy. Within months, physicists worldwide recognized the military implications. When war came to Europe in September 1939 and then engulfed the world after December 1941, the race to weaponize atomic energy became a matter of national survival. Kenneth Bainbridge had been a respected but relatively obscure physics professor at Harvard when he was recruited to the Manhattan Project in 1943. His specialty was mass spectrometry, useful for isotope separation, but far removed from the cutting-edge theoretical physics that had revealed the atom's secrets. He was, in his own estimation, a practical man tasked with practical problems. How to assemble the scientific instruments that would measure an unprecedented event. How to coordinate the dozens of cameras that would photograph it. How to ensure the safety of the hundreds of personnel involved. He approached the Trinity test as an engineering challenge, a complex but ultimately manageable problem of coordination and execution. What Bainbridge and most of his colleagues believed as they worked through the spring and early summer of 1945 was that they were building a very large bomb. Larger than any conventional weapon, certainly, but still fundamentally a bomb, a device that released its energy quickly for military purposes. They understood the physics, had calculated the yields, knew about chain reactions and critical mass. But understanding the mathematics of nuclear fission and comprehending its implications were entirely different things. Theory, no matter how elegant, could not prepare the human mind for the reality of matter converting directly into energy according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, where c, the speed of light, was a number so large that even a tiny mass converted to energy produced unimaginable results. The Manhattan Project had consumed over $2 billion and employed more than 130,000 people at its peak, most of whom had no idea what they were building. The project's director, General Leslie Groves, had assembled an unprecedented concentration of scientific talent at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the leadership of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The laboratory, perched on a remote mesa in the high desert, had become a secret city of brilliant minds racing against time and against the fear that German scientists might achieve success first. By the summer of 1945, that fear had diminished. Germany had surrendered on May 8th, and post-war interrogations revealed that the German atomic program, led by Werner Heisenberg, had never come close to building a working reactor, much less a bomb. Heisenberg's decision to use heavy water as a neutron moderator, combined with Allied sabotage of Norwegian heavy water production facilities, had crippled the German effort. After the war, Heisenberg would claim he had never intended to build a weapon, that he had deliberately steered the research away from military applications. His colleagues remained divided on whether this was conscience or rationalization. The Japanese program, though less well known to the Americans, had similarly failed to achieve significant progress. Lieutenant General Takeo Yasuda had secured uranium deposits in northern Korea and recruited Japan's leading nuclear physicist, Yoshio Nishida, to lead the research. A facility at Hungnam processed uranium ore, but the technical challenges proved insurmountable for a nation whose industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by American bombing. Rumors would later circulate that Japan had conducted a nuclear test on August 10th, 1945, 4 days after Hiroshima, but no credible evidence supported these claims. The Soviet program, beginning in September 1941 under Igor Kurchatov, had progressed further than the Americans realized. Soviet intelligence had successfully penetrated Los Alamos through Klaus Fuchs, a German refugee physicist, and Theodore Hall, an American scientist. Neither spy knew of the other's existence, but both provided detailed technical information to Soviet handlers. This espionage would not become fully known for years, and in July 1945, American scientists still believed they alone possessed the secret of atomic weapons. The testing ground, the site chosen for the Trinity test, lay in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a desolate stretch of desert in the northern sector of the Alamogordo bombing range. The terrain was flat, empty, and remote enough to maintain secrecy while providing a buffer zone in case the explosion proved larger than predicted or produced unexpected effects. Military police had established checkpoints throughout the area by early 1945, and soldiers had been stationed at the site since fall 1944 to maintain physical security. The device itself, nicknamed Gadget by the scientists, represented the implosion design developed by the Los Alamos team. Unlike the simpler gun-type design planned for the uranium bomb, the implosion weapon used conventional explosives arranged in a precise spherical pattern to compress a subcritical plutonium core into a supercritical state, initiating a chain reaction. The design was elegant in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in practice, requiring explosives that detonated with perfect simultaneity and compression waves that converged with precision measured in nanoseconds. On May 7th, more than 2 months before the main test, Bainbridge's team had detonated 108 tons of TNT to calibrate their instruments and give observers a sense of what to expect. The blast had been impressive by conventional standards, but it was merely a calibration shot, a baseline against which to measure the real test. The scientists' predictions for the atomic test varied wildly. The pessimists, or perhaps the more cautious, suggested yields as low as 0 kilotons, a complete fizzle. The optimists, or perhaps the more reckless, calculated yields up to 18 kilotons. Robbie's prediction of 18 kilotons would prove closest to reality, but some predictions went further. Edward Teller and others had calculated, in a famous series of meetings, the probability that an atomic explosion might ignite a fusion reaction in the nitrogen of Earth's atmosphere. The calculations had shown the risk to be negligible, near zero, but not absolutely zero. Hans Bethe had checked and rechecked the mathematics, and the consensus was that atmospheric ignition was impossible. Yet the fact that serious physicists had spent time calculating the odds of accidentally incinerating the planet spoke to the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting. They were about to create temperatures and pressures that existed nowhere on Earth, that occurred naturally only in the cores of stars. The final hours. The test had originally been scheduled for 4 o'clock in the morning on July 16th. But thunderstorms moved into the area during the night, forcing a delay. Lightning posed a genuine danger. An electrical strike on the tower holding the device could potentially set off the conventional explosives prematurely. At 4:30 in the morning, with rain still falling and lightning still flashing across the desert, Groves and Oppenheimer conferred with meteorologist Jack Hubbard, who predicted the weather would clear by 5:30. The decision was made to proceed, with a new detonation time of 5:29 and 45 seconds. In the hours before dawn, personnel moved to their observation posts. 2 bunkers had been constructed at different distances from ground zero. The control bunker, located 10,000 meters south of the tower, housed the firing controls and timing equipment. The observation bunkers at 16 and 32 kilometers provided viewing positions for the various observers. Over 258 people would witness the test directly, with many more at greater distances. Oppenheimer and General Thomas Farrell, the military officer placed in charge of the test, positioned themselves in the 16-kilometer bunker along with most of the senior scientists. General Groves, characteristically cautious, watched from the 32-kilometer bunker. They had been issued welder's glasses to protect their eyes from the flash, though no one knew if these would prove adequate. The observers had been instructed to lie face down on the ground, facing away from the explosion, until the flash subsided. 3 days earlier, scientists had assembled the plutonium core at McDonald Ranch House, 2 miles from ground zero. The core, manufactured at the Hanford site in Washington State, contained approximately 6.2 kilograms of plutonium-239. Surrounding this core were layers of conventional explosives, precisely shaped and carefully wired to detonators that would fire simultaneously, compressing the plutonium to criticality in a matter of microseconds. The assembled device had been raised to the top of a 30-meter steel tower on July 13th. The tower was constructed of Standard Oil derrick components, sturdy enough to support the device's weight, but designed to be instantly vaporized by the explosion. The height was chosen to maximize the formation of the characteristic mushroom cloud and to allow for comprehensive photographic documentation. Berlin Brixner's camera team had positioned dozens of high-speed cameras at various distances and angles, using different film speeds and exposure settings to capture as much data as possible about the explosion's development. As 5:29 approached, physicist Samuel K. Allison read the final countdown over the public address system, his voice echoing across the desert from loudspeakers at each observation station. The scientists who had spent years bringing this moment into existence now found themselves spectators to their own creation. Bainbridge, standing in the bunker with telephone receivers at both ears, maintained communication with both the control bunker and the various instrument stations. His role as test director meant he bore ultimate responsibility for the safety and success of the operation. But in these final seconds, he could only wait and watch. The first revelation. At 5:29 and 45 seconds, the firing circuit closed, sending electrical impulses to the 32 detonators surrounding the plutonium core. The conventional explosives fired, their shock waves converging on the core with precisely calculated timing. The plutonium compressed, density increasing until free neutrons initiated a chain reaction. Each fission released energy and more neutrons, triggering more fissions in an exponentially accelerating cascade. Within 1 microsecond, the chain reaction had propagated through the plutonium mass. Within 1 millisecond, the temperature at the core exceeded that of the sun's surface. The light came first, traveling at 300 million meters per second. Those watching from the bunkers saw, even through closed eyes and welder's glass, a brilliance that defied description. It was golden, purple, violet, gray, and blue. General Farrell would later write in his official report. The whole country was lighted by a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun. It lighted every peak, crevasse, and ridge of the nearby mountain range with a clarity and beauty that cannot be described but must be seen to be imagined. Dr. Joseph McKibben, who had designed the firing mechanism, later testified, "I was stationed in the control bunker, my hand on the firing switch. When the light came, it was like nothing I had ever imagined. The instrument panel in front of me, in the darkness before dawn, suddenly cast shadows as though lit by 1,000 spotlights. The light penetrated the concrete walls, the steel door, everything. For that moment, night became a day brighter than any natural day. And I understood that we had created something that transcended all previous human experience, with energy and matter." 25-year-old physicist Richard Feynman, who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work in quantum mechanics, had positioned himself in a truck 16 kilometers from ground zero. Unlike the others, he watched the blast directly without protective glasses, reasoning that the truck's windshield would filter the ultraviolet radiation. He later recorded, "The whole sky turned this brilliant orange-yellow, brighter than the brightest sunlight I'd ever seen. It was so bright that everything in the desert became illuminated with this strange, beautiful, terrible light. I could see the mountains in the distance, see individual rocks on the ground, see the faces of the other observers, all lit by this impossible radiance that seemed to have no source and no direction. that simply existed everywhere at once. The fireball expanded at velocities approaching the speed of sound, a sphere of superheated plasma converting the tower, the device, and the surrounding sand into ionized gas. Within the first second, the fireball reached a diameter of over 300 meters, its temperature still measuring in the millions of degrees. The desert sand beneath and around the tower melted instantly, then re-solidified as the fireball lifted, creating a layer of glassy substance later named Trinitite, pale green and mildly radioactive, fused by heat beyond anything that had existed on Earth's surface. Then came the sound and the shock wave, traveling at the relatively pedestrian speed of approximately 340 meters per second. At the 16-kilometer bunker, the shock wave arrived 47 seconds after the light, a thunderclap that shook the concrete structure and pressed against the chests of those inside. Kenneth Bainbridge, his hand still holding the telephone receivers, spoke the first words that came to his mind. "Now, we are all sons of bitches." J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, stood silent as the mushroom cloud rose into the dawn sky. Later, he would report that a line from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture, had come to his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But in that moment, watching the cloud climb toward the stratosphere, he simply mumbled, "It worked." The scale becomes clear. As dawn broke fully over the New Mexico desert and the mushroom cloud continued its climb toward the stratosphere, observers began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. The cloud rose to a height of 12 kilometers, punching through multiple layers of atmosphere, its characteristic mushroom shape forming as hot gases expanded upward and cooler air rushed in to fill the vacuum below. The pillar connecting the mushroom cap to the ground was clearly visible from the observation bunkers, a column of debris and vaporized matter driven upward by forces beyond human scale. The crater left at ground zero measured 3 meters deep and 330 meters wide, a depression carved by the initial fireball and compacted by the immense pressure of the blast wave. The steel tower had simply ceased to exist, vaporized into its component atoms and scattered across the desert. The sand within a radius of several hundred meters had been transformed into glass, a layer of trinitite covering approximately 30,000 square meters of desert floor. The shock wave was detected over 300 kilometers away. Residents of Albuquerque, 150 kilometers north, felt their windows rattle. People in Gallup, 235 kilometers northwest, saw the flash on the horizon. A woman driving on Highway 60 near Socorro saw a light brighter than the sun illuminate the entire eastern sky. Cattle on ranches up to 30 kilometers away stampeded in panic. Yet the remoteness of the location and the early hour meant that relatively few civilians witnessed the test directly. At the observation bunkers, scientists began taking stock of their instruments. Many had been destroyed by the intensity of the blast. Cameras designed to photograph the explosion had been knocked over or buried in sand. Radiation counters had been overwhelmed, their needles slammed to the maximum of their scales. Dr. Herbert Anderson, who had helped design the instrumentation, later recorded, "We had expected a large explosion, certainly. We had calculated yields, prepared our instruments for what we thought would happen. But the reality exceeded our preparations. Devices rated to measure kiloton range explosions were simply saturated. Cameras were damaged, equipment failed. It was as though we had prepared to weigh an elephant and found ourselves trying to weigh a mountain." The calculations began immediately. Multiple measurement methods converged on a yield of approximately 20 kilotons of TNT equivalent. This meant that roughly 6 kilograms of plutonium had released energy equivalent to the detonation of 40 million pounds of conventional explosives. The efficiency was staggering. Approximately 13% of the plutonium had undergone fission, with each fissioning atom releasing approximately 200 million electron volts of energy. The numbers, when fully understood, revealed a fundamental transformation in the relationship between mass and energy. Dr. Philip Morrison, another Los Alamos physicist, attempted to convey the scale. The entire combined payload of every bomber in the 8th Air Force, the force that had devastated German industry over 4 years of strategic bombing, amounted to perhaps 1 million tons of high explosives. A single device weighing 5 tons had released 1/50th of that destructive power in a fraction of a second. If we could build 50 such devices, and we knew we could equal the entire strategic bombing effort of the European war in 50 individual explosions, each delivered by a single aircraft. The human dimension. As the sun rose higher and the mushroom cloud began to dissipate, diffused by upper atmosphere winds, the scientists and military personnel at Trinity began the long drive back to Los Alamos. The roads were rough, the vehicles crowded, and an unusual silence prevailed. Men who had spent years working toward this moment, who had celebrated other, smaller successes with enthusiasm and relief, now sat quietly, processing what they had witnessed. Dr. Robert Serber, one of Oppenheimer's closest colleagues, later wrote in his journal, "The drive back to Los Alamos took 3 hours. I shared a vehicle with 4 other physicists, all of whom I had worked with daily for 2 years. We barely spoke. Each of us, I think, was conducting his own internal accounting, tallying what we had accomplished against what we had unleashed. We had succeeded brilliantly. We had achieved something that many said was impossible, that the greatest minds of the previous generation would have considered science fiction. And yet that success felt less like triumph than like responsibility, a weight settling onto our shoulders that would never lift." Lieutenant Colonel Pierre de Silva, Chief of Security at Los Alamos, had been responsible for safeguarding the project's secrets from foreign intelligence services. He later testified, "I had spent 2 years worrying about spies, about information leaks, about whether the Germans or the Japanese might be ahead of us in the race to build the bomb. The Trinity test made all of that seem almost quaint. Yes, we had maintained security. Yes, we had protected our technical secrets. But we had also just demonstrated to ourselves that human beings could now destroy entire cities in seconds. The security problem had not ended with a successful test. It had, in fact, just begun, and on a scale I had not previously imagined. Some observers grappled with the implications through the lens of religious or philosophical tradition. Dr. Kenneth Greisen, a young physicist who had worked on the instrumentation, recorded his thoughts days after the test. "I was raised to believe in a just God, in a moral universe where human actions have consequences beyond the merely physical. Standing in that bunker, watching light that should not exist on Earth's surface, I wondered if we had crossed a line that should not be crossed. The prophets spoke of Judgment Day, of fire raining from the sky, of the world ending in flame. We had just created the means to fulfill those prophecies, not through divine intervention, but through human ingenuity. I am not certain whether that represents humanity's greatest achievement or its greatest sin. Perhaps it is both." Others focused on the immediate practical implications. General Thomas Farrell, in his official report, noted, "The effect on the surrounding countryside, even at distances up to 60 miles, was clearly visible. The psychological effect of such a weapon on enemy populations would be incalculable. A single aircraft carrying a single bomb could accomplish what previously required hundreds of aircraft flying multiple missions. The implications for the war against Japan and for the nature of warfare itself are too significant to fully express in a brief report. Dr. Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist who had created the world's first sustained nuclear chain reaction in Chicago 3 years earlier, conducted a simple experiment during the Trinity test. As the shock wave arrived, he dropped torn pieces of paper and measured how far the blast displaced them, roughly 6 meters. From this measurement, he quickly calculated a yield of approximately 10 kilotons, close to the more sophisticated measurements made by instruments. But afterward, he reflected. Any physicist with basic knowledge could have made that calculation from that measurement. What no calculation could capture was the sense of having witnessed something fundamentally new in human history. We had created a star on Earth, if only for a moment. The question now was what we would do with that knowledge. The impossible choice. The Trinity test had always been planned as a proof of concept, a demonstration that the implosion design would work before committing to the expensive and time-consuming task of manufacturing multiple weapons. The gun-type uranium bomb required no test. The physics were straightforward, and the Manhattan Project's limited supply of uranium-235 was too precious to waste on a demonstration. But the implosion design was complex, and a failed test would have meant months or years of additional work, time the war might not allow. Now, with the test confirmed as a success, the path forward was clear from a technical standpoint. 2 bombs were already in production. Little Boy, the gun-type uranium device, and Fat Man, an implosion plutonium weapon identical in design to the Trinity gadget. Within days, these weapons would be loaded onto a specially modified B-29 and flown to Tinian Island in the Pacific, where the 509th Composite Group had been training for a special mission they could only vaguely understand. But for many scientists at Los Alamos, the Trinity test had transformed an abstract technical challenge into a moral crisis. They had always known, in theory, that their work was intended to create weapons. The project had been initiated, funded, and organized for explicitly military purposes. Yet the abstraction of theoretical physics and the concrete reality of a fireball 12 kilometers high proved to be very different things. Dr. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had been among the first to recognize the military potential of nuclear fission, had circulated a petition weeks before the Trinity test. The document, eventually signed by 70 scientists, urged that the bomb not be used against Japan without clear warning and a demonstration of its power to representatives of neutral nations. Szilard argued that using the weapon against cities would initiate an arms race that would ultimately endanger American security more than it enhanced it. The petition never reached President Harry Truman. General Groves ensured it was classified and routed through channels where it would not influence policy decisions. From the military perspective, the bomb offered a way to end the war quickly, saving the lives of American soldiers who would otherwise participate in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Intelligence estimates suggested such an invasion could cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. If a demonstration of atomic weapons could force Japanese surrender without an invasion, the calculus seemed clear. Dr. James Franck, another prominent physicist, chaired a committee that produced a more detailed report arguing against military use of the bomb. The Franck report, completed in June 1945, made both moral and strategic arguments. It suggested that using atomic weapons against cities would damage America's moral standing, make international control of atomic energy more difficult, and initiate an arms race that would leave the world less secure. The report recommended a demonstration on a barren island, witnessed by Japanese observers as a better alternative. These objections circulated among the scientific community, but gained little traction in military and political circles. Secretary of War Henry Stimson convened a committee of senior officials and scientists, including Oppenheimer, to advise on the question. The committee recommended that the bomb be used against a military target in a city without warning for maximum psychological impact. Oppenheimer supported this recommendation, reasoning that only the shock of an actual use against a real target would adequately demonstrate the weapon's significance. The contrast with prediction, the Trinity test, revealed how inadequate human intuition was for understanding nuclear weapons. Even the scientists who had designed the bomb and calculated its yield found their predictions contradicted by reality in ways both subtle and profound. Dr. Hans Bethe, chief of the theoretical division at Los Alamos, had calculated a yield of approximately 8 kilotons. His estimate was derived from sophisticated models of neutron multiplication and energy release in the plutonium core. The actual yield of 20 kilotons exceeded his prediction by a factor of 2.5. When asked after the test about this discrepancy, Beth responded, "Our theoretical models captured the essential physics of the chain reaction. We understood the neutron cross-sections, the multiplication factor, the energy per fission. But the actual dynamics of an explosion compressed into microseconds, with shock waves interacting with compression waves interacting with neutron fluxes at temperatures exceeding 10 million degrees. Such calculations pushed beyond the limits of our theoretical framework. We were correct in principle, but inadequate in detail." Other predictions had been even less accurate. Some scientists, genuinely uncertain about whether the implosion design would work, had estimated yields as low as 0.3 kilotons, or suggested the weapon might fizzle completely. Edward Teller, always optimistic about nuclear yields, had predicted 45 kilotons. Each prediction reflected sophisticated understanding of nuclear physics. Yet the range from 0 to 45 kilotons demonstrated the fundamental uncertainty inherent in predicting unprecedented phenomena. The psychological predictions proved even more inadequate. Military planners had assumed that atomic weapons would be perceived as very large conventional bombs, shocking in their power, but comprehensible within existing frameworks of military thinking. Instead, witnesses described experiences that transcended military categories entirely. The light was compared not to explosions, but to the sun, to stars, to divine phenomena. The mushroom cloud evoked not tactical assessments, but existential dread. Dr. Victor Weisskopf, an Austrian physicist who had worked on the theoretical models, later reflected, "We predicted the energy release with reasonable accuracy. We predicted the crater diameter, the shockwave velocity, the fireball temperature. What we utterly failed to predict was the emotional and psychological impact of witnessing such a thing." Numbers on a page, equations in a notebook, these are abstractions. The reality of Trinity was that we had created a phenomenon that belonged more to mythology than to physics, a power that previous generations would have attributed to gods rather than to human engineering. Our calculations had been correct, but our imaginations had been entirely insufficient. The broader pattern. The Trinity test was not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of a broader pattern in 20th century science and technology, a pattern of accelerating capability outpacing human wisdom about its application. The gap between what humanity could do and what humanity should do had been growing throughout the industrial age, but never before had that gap widened so suddenly or so dramatically. The speed of atomic weapons development had been extraordinary. In December 1938, fission had been discovered. By December 1942, Enrico Fermi had achieved a controlled chain reaction. 30 months later, on July 16, 1945, the first atomic weapon had exploded with a yield of 20 kilotons. From scientific curiosity to weapon of unprecedented power in less than 7 years. A development trajectory faster than most conventional weapons programs. Compare this to previous weapons revolutions. Gunpowder, invented in China in the 9th century, took centuries to transform warfare. The machine gun, developed in the mid-19th century, required decades to achieve widespread military adoption. Even aircraft, demonstrated by the Wright brothers in 1903, took more than a decade before military applications were seriously pursued. But atomic weapons went from laboratory discovery to deployed status in less than 1 decade, and the implications of that acceleration troubled many observers. Dr. Isidore Rabi, whose prediction of 18 kilotons had come closest to the actual yield, later testified before Congress. The speed with which we developed these weapons was both our greatest achievement and our greatest danger. We succeeded because we had theoretical knowledge, industrial capacity, and urgent motivation from the war. But success came so quickly that we had no time to develop parallel frameworks for thinking about control, about limitations, about the political and moral structures that should govern such power. We built the weapons faster than we built the wisdom to use them wisely. The financial investment in the Manhattan Project, over $2 billion, exceeded the cost of many entire conventional military programs. The B-29 bomber program, developing the aircraft that would eventually deliver atomic weapons, cost $3 billion. The Manhattan Project and B-29 program together consumed approximately $5 billion, roughly equivalent to the entire federal budget for 1940. The scale of investment reflected not just scientific curiosity, but a fundamental transformation in how nations approached military capability, concentrating resources on technological breakthrough rather than incremental improvement. The human resources were equally unprecedented. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed 130,000 people at facilities across the United States. The uranium enrichment plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, consumed more electrical power than most American cities. The plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington, covered an area larger than many military bases. The scale of the project created its own security through compartmentalization. Most workers knew only their small piece of the effort, unaware of the larger purpose. The global context. While the American program had succeeded brilliantly, atomic weapons development was never exclusively an American endeavor. The scientific knowledge underlying fission was international, published in journals accessible to physicists worldwide. The realization that fission could be weaponized had occurred simultaneously in multiple countries. Only the industrial capacity and organizational focus required to actually build weapons had remained concentrated in the United States. The German program, revealed after the war to have never approached weapons production, had nonetheless employed many of the world's most distinguished physicists. Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Max von Laue, and others had worked on various aspects of atomic energy under Nazi patronage. The failure of the German program stemmed from multiple factors. Heisenberg's technical decisions, Allied bombing of German industry, commando raids on heavy water facilities in Norway, and perhaps most significantly, the Nazi regime's purge of Jewish scientists that had driven much of Germany's best talent into exile. Many of the scientists at Los Alamos were refugees from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Enrico Fermi had fled Italy with his Jewish wife. Hans Betty, Emilio Segre, Edward Teller, Leo Szilard and many others had left Germany as the Nazis rose to power. The Manhattan Project succeeded in part because American openness to immigration had collected in one place the scientific talent that totalitarian regimes had driven away. The irony was not lost on observers. Persecution and intolerance in Europe had contributed directly to Allied victory and American atomic monopoly. The Soviet program, shrouded in secrecy, had nonetheless made significant progress through a combination of native talent and espionage. Igor Kurchatov led a team of skilled physicists who understood the theoretical principles of fission weapons. Klaus Fuchs, a German refugee working at Los Alamos, passed detailed technical information to Soviet intelligence throughout the war. Theodore Hall, an American physicist, independently provided similar information. Neither spy knew of the other's existence, yet both ensured that the Soviet Union would not be far behind the United States in developing atomic weapons. The intelligence flow was remarkable in its breadth and detail. Fuchs provided information on the implosion design, calculations of critical mass, details of initiator construction, and even estimates of the American stockpile of uranium and plutonium. Hall focused on different technical aspects, providing independent confirmation of Fuchs's information and filling in gaps. Soviet physicists could check their own calculations against detailed American data, accelerating their program by years. Yet even with this espionage advantage, the Soviet Union would not test its first atomic weapon until August 29, 1949, more than 4 years after Trinity. The gap reflected not lack of knowledge, but lack of industrial infrastructure. Building the uranium enrichment plants and plutonium production reactors required massive industrial capacity that the Soviet Union, still recovering from devastating German invasion, could only slowly assemble. The irony of warning. And one of the great ironies of the atomic age was that the scientists who built the bomb had also been among the first to warn of its dangers. In the years before the Manhattan Project formally existed, physicists had understood both the potential of atomic weapons and the risk that Nazi Germany might develop them first. Their warnings had helped initiate the American program. Yet those same warnings were largely ignored when it came to the question of how such weapons should be used or controlled. Albert Einstein, whose equation E equals mc squared, had provided the theoretical foundation for understanding nuclear energy, never worked directly on the Manhattan Project. He had been deemed a security risk due to his pacifist political views. Yet his signature on a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt in August 1939, drafted by Leo Szilard, had been crucial in initiating American atomic research. The letter warned that extremely powerful bombs of a new type might be constructed, and that German scientists were already exploring the possibility. By 1945, with the war in Europe over and the bomb nearing completion, Einstein had come to regret that letter. In later years, he would call it the one great mistake of my life, though he acknowledged that without the letter, the United States might not have developed atomic weapons in time to prevent a Nazi bomb. The regret stemmed not from the American bomb itself, but from the realization that once one nation possessed such weapons, all nations would seek them, and the world would never again be free from the threat of atomic destruction. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist whose model of the atom had shaped modern physics, had spent considerable effort trying to convince Allied leaders that international control of atomic energy should be established before weapons were used. He argued that secrecy was ultimately futile, that scientific knowledge could not be monopolized for long, and that only open cooperation and shared governance could prevent an arms race. He met with Churchill and Roosevelt, making his case for transparency and international agreements. both leaders listened politely and then proceeded with military planning that assumed American monopoly would persist. The Frank Report, the Szilard Petition, Bohr's diplomatic efforts, all represented attempts by scientists to shape the political and military use of their technical creation. All were largely ineffective, illustrating a fundamental asymmetry in modern societies. Technical expertise grants limited influence over political decisions, even when those decisions involve deployment of technical capabilities. Scientists could build atomic weapons, but they could not control how those weapons would be used or what international framework would govern them. The psychological transformation. In the days and weeks after Trinity, those who had witnessed the test began processing what they had seen. For some, the experience solidified their commitment to the war effort and their belief that atomic weapons would save lives by forcing Japanese surrender. For others, Trinity marked the beginning of a lifelong struggle with the morality of what they had helped create. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director whose first words after the explosion had been, "Now we are all sons of bitches," later elaborated on that reaction. I did not mean it as a criticism of the bomb itself or of those who made it. I meant it as recognition that we had entered a new era of human history, one in which our technical capabilities had fundamentally outstripped our moral and political institutions. We were now capable of destroying cities, of killing hundreds of thousands of people in an instant, and the machinery of civilization had not caught up with that capability. We had the power of gods, but the wisdom only of men. J. Robert Oppenheimer's psychological journey was more complex and would extend over decades. In the immediate aftermath of Trinity, he felt primarily relief that the device had worked and satisfaction that years of intense effort had achieved their goal. His oft-quoted reference to the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," came later in retrospect, as he attempted to articulate the significance of what he had witnessed. In the moment, his reaction had been simpler and more practical. It worked. But as weeks turned to months and the bombs were used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer's feelings became more conflicted. He had supported military use of the weapons, had served on the committee that recommended their deployment against cities. Yet the reality of tens of thousands of people killed in an instant, many more dying slowly from radiation exposure, created a psychological burden that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dr. Joseph Rotblat, a Polish physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project early in the war, had left Los Alamos before Trinity, resigning once it became clear that Germany would not develop atomic weapons first. He later explained, "My motivation for joining the project had been fear of Nazi Germany possessing such weapons. Once Germany surrendered, the original rationale disappeared. I could not justify continuing to work on weapons that would be used not against Hitler, but against Japan. When I left Los Alamos in December 1944, many of my colleagues thought I was naive, that I didn't understand military necessity. But after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of them came to understand my position better. The world would have been no worse off if atomic weapons had never been developed, and might have been considerably better off." For many younger scientists, Trinity represented not crisis, but confirmation. They had joined the project fresh from graduate school, had spent their formative professional years working on weapons development, and saw the successful test as validation of their technical abilities rather than as moral challenge. Dr. Richard Feynman, who would later express ambivalence about his wartime work, recalled his immediate reaction as excitement rather than dread. "I was so focused on whether it would work and whether our calculations had been correct that the broader implications didn't hit me until later. We were young, we were brilliant, We had solved an incredibly difficult technical problem, and that success felt glorious. The moral dimension emerged more slowly as the war ended and we had time to think about what we'd actually accomplished. The contrast intensifies. The days following Trinity brought increasing evidence of just how unprepared human institutions were for atomic weapons. The test had been conducted in secret, with elaborate cover stories prepared to explain the flash and blast if civilian witnesses reported it. The Alamogordo Air Base issued a press release claiming an ammunition dump had accidentally exploded, causing no injuries. The story was plausible enough that it generated little media interest, and the test remained secret for 3 weeks. On August 6, 1945, 3 weeks after Trinity, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The city, home to approximately 350,000 people, was largely destroyed. Initial casualty estimates ranged from 70,000 to 140,000 dead, with many more injured. The bomb had exploded at an altitude of approximately 600 meters, optimized to maximize blast damage across the widest possible area. The airburst created a flash of thermal radiation that ignited fires throughout the city, followed by a shock wave that collapsed buildings and buried survivors in rubble. 3 days later, on August 9th, Fat Man, using the same implosion design proven at Trinity, destroyed Nagasaki. This bomb, originally intended for the city of Kokura, had been diverted to Nagasaki as its secondary target after clouds obscured Kokura. The city's geography, surrounded by hills, somewhat contained the blast, but casualties still ranged from 40,000 to 70,000 people killed immediately, with thousands more dying in subsequent weeks from radiation exposure and injuries. The contrast between Trinity and the attacks on Japanese cities was stark. Trinity had been conducted in a remote desert, harming no one, demonstrating technical capabilities in a controlled environment. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities filled with civilians, military personnel, industrial workers, children, elderly people, the complete spectrum of human society. The weapons that had been tested as scientific experiments were deployed as instruments of mass death. And the psychological distance between theoretical demonstration and actual use proved far smaller than many scientists had hoped. Dr. Philip Morrison, who later visited Hiroshima to study the bomb's effects, recorded his observations. The theoretical calculations had predicted blast radii, thermal effects, shockwave propagation. The reality was neighborhoods of wooden houses completely incinerated. Stone buildings collapsed. Human shadows burned onto concrete walls where people had been standing when the thermal pulse arrived. The mathematics had been accurate, but mathematics cannot capture the horror of entire city blocks filled with charred bodies, or of hospitals overwhelmed with victims whose skin had been burned away, or of children wandering in shock looking for parents who had been vaporized. We had calculated the blast effects. We had not imagined the human effects. The military perspective. For military planners, atomic weapons represented a revolution in strategic thinking comparable to the introduction of gunpowder or mechanized warfare. The immediate effect was to end the war with Japan. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, 6 days after Nagasaki. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, was canceled. Casualty estimates for that invasion had ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million Allied casualties, with Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially numbering in the millions. General Curtis LeMay, who had directed the conventional firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, later assessed, the atomic bombs killed approximately 150,000 people in 2 attacks. My conventional bombing campaign had killed comparable numbers over the course of months, destroying city after city with incendiary bombs. The atomic weapons accomplished in 2 missions what had previously required thousands of bomber sorties, tens of thousands of aircrew, and months of sustained effort. From a military standpoint, they were vastly more efficient, requiring fewer resources and risking fewer American lives. Whether that efficiency justified their use is a moral question I am not qualified to answer. But the military effectiveness was undeniable. Admiral William Leahy, President Truman's chief military advisor, expressed a different view. The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling is that in being the first to use it, we adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that. Fashion and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. The debate over whether atomic bombs were necessary to force Japanese surrender would continue for decades. Defenders argued that Japan's military leadership was prepared to fight to the bitter end, that the imperial government would never have surrendered without decisive shock, and that the alternative of invasion would have cost more lives on both sides. Critics countered that Japan was already seeking surrender terms through neutral intermediaries, that conventional bombing and naval blockade were strangling Japanese industry and agriculture, and that the bombs were used more to impress the Soviet Union than to defeat Japan. What was undeniable was that atomic weapons had compressed the timeline of warfare. Decisions that previously unfolded over months of conventional bombing campaigns now occurred in seconds. A single aircraft, a single bomb, a single mission could accomplish destruction that had previously required sustained strategic bombing efforts. The implications for military planning were profound. Wars might now be decided in hours or days rather than months or years. The secret emerges. On August 12, 1945, 3 days after Nagasaki, the government released the Smith Report, officially titled Atomic Energy for Military Purposes, written by physicist Henry DeWolf Smith. The report provided an overview of the Manhattan Project's scientific work, explaining in general terms how atomic weapons functioned and how the project had been organized. The report was carefully crafted to reveal enough to explain what had occurred while protecting specific technical details that might be useful to other nations. The public reaction was a mixture of relief that the war was ending, awe at American scientific achievement, and dawning horror at the nature of the new weapons. Newspaper editorials struggled to articulate the significance of atomic energy. Religious leaders grappled with the morality of weapons that killed indiscriminately. Political commentators debated whether the United States should share atomic secrets with its allies or maintain monopoly. The atomic age had begun, and the entire world was suddenly confronted with questions for which no historical precedents provided answers. For those who had witnessed Trinity, the public revelation came with complex emotions. Dr. Robert Wilson, who had supervised instrumentation at the test site, later wrote, "For 3 weeks, we had carried the secret of what we had witnessed in the desert. We knew that atomic weapons existed, that they worked, that they were more powerful than anyone had publicly imagined. Then Hiroshima happened, and the secret became global knowledge. But the public learned about atomic weapons through their use against a city, through casualty reports and destruction photographs. They didn't see the clinical test in the desert, the scientific measurements, the careful preparations. They saw death and destruction and associated atomic energy with horror. We had witnessed Trinity as a scientific triumph. The world learned about atomic weapons as instruments of mass killing. That disjunction haunted many of us. the long shadow. In the years and decades following Trinity, the test site would become a location of contested memory and ongoing consequence. In 1952, the crater was bulldozed, and most of the trinitite was collected and buried to reduce radiation exposure. But low-level radiation persisted, measuring approximately 10 times the natural background even 60 years after the explosion. The site was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1965, with limited public access granted twice annually for commemorative purposes. For local residents, particularly downwind of the test site, the long-term health effects became a source of ongoing concern and controversy. Fallout from Trinity had been less significant than from later atmospheric tests, but studies in subsequent decades suggested elevated cancer rates in communities downwind of the blast. The federal government, initially dismissive of such claims, eventually established compensation programs for downwinders exposed to radiation from atmospheric nuclear tests, though questions about adequate compensation and full disclosure continued. The broader legacy of Trinity extended far beyond the immediate test site. The successful demonstration of implosion design made possible the expansion of America's atomic arsenal. By 1967, the United States possessed approximately 31,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon in August 1949, much sooner than American intelligence had predicted, largely due to the espionage conducted during the Manhattan Project. Britain tested its first atomic weapon in October 1952. France followed in February 1960. China achieved its first nuclear test in October 1964. Each new nuclear power cited security concerns and national prestige as justification for developing atomic weapons. Each claimed to seek only defensive capabilities. Yet the cumulative effect was an arms race that, at its peak during the Cold War, saw the United States and Soviet Union each possessing arsenals capable of destroying human civilization many times over. The balance of terror, as it came to be called, represented a form of strategic stability, but one predicated on the threat of mutual annihilation. Dr. Leo Szilard, who had initiated the American atomic program with his letter for Einstein to sign, spent the post-war decades advocating for arms control. He founded the Council for a Livable World in 1962, dedicated to reducing nuclear dangers. In his later writings, Szilard reflected, "I pressed for the atomic bomb to be developed because I feared Hitler would get it first. That fear proved groundless. But by the time we knew that, the bomb was nearly ready. We used it against Japan, inaugurating an era of nuclear proliferation that may ultimately prove more dangerous than anything Hitler could have done. The question I cannot answer is whether, knowing what I know now, I would still have sent that letter to Roosevelt. The bomb was coming regardless, developed by someone in some nation. Perhaps American development was preferable to Nazi development. But the chain of events set in motion by that letter led directly to a world living under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. The psychological persistence. For those who witnessed Trinity directly, the experience remained vivid across decades. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of the test, several participants returned to the site for a commemorative gathering. The conversations among these aging scientists and military personnel revealed how the weight of Trinity had shaped their subsequent lives. Dr. Ernest Lawrence, inventor of the cyclotron and a key figure in uranium enrichment, had died in 1958. But his colleague, Dr. Luis Alvarez, who had flown on observation aircraft during both the Trinity test and the Hiroshima bombing, reflected, "We were young men, the youngest generation of physicists, trained in quantum mechanics and nuclear physics. We had the confidence of youth and the support of our government. We built atomic weapons because we could, because the physics was fascinating, because we were at war. Looking back 30 years later, I understand why some of our colleagues had misgivings, why some left the project or protested its use. But I remain convinced that, given the context of total war against fascism, developing the bomb was necessary. Whether using it was necessary remains a harder question. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who died in 1967, never fully reconciled his role in atomic weapons development. After the war, he became director of the Institute for Advanced Study and served as chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission. In that capacity, he opposed development of the hydrogen bomb, arguing that atomic weapons were sufficient for deterrence and that thermonuclear weapons would escalate the arms race to catastrophic levels. His opposition contributed to the revocation of his security clearance in 1954, a humiliating end to his government service. In one of his final interviews, Oppenheimer was asked if he regretted his role in developing atomic weapons. His answer was carefully constructed. The atom bomb made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us to recognize that we must be willing to live with the enemy, live together, move toward some system of international control, and not rely on force in the settlement of disputes. We had hoped that this recognition would come much sooner, that the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would immediately produce international cooperation. That hope was naive. But the recognition has come slowly and incompletely, that atomic weapons make war obsolete as a tool of national policy. Whether that recognition came soon enough to save us from nuclear catastrophe, we will not know until history's judgment is complete. The final irony. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 and 45 seconds in the morning, a prototype weapon nicknamed Gadget was detonated atop a steel tower in the New Mexico desert. The explosion released energy equivalent to approximately 20 kilotons of TNT, creating a crater 3 meters deep and 330 meters wide, converting desert sand into pale green glass and sending a mushroom cloud 12 kilometers into the stratosphere. 258 observers witnessed the test from various distances, watching as humanity demonstrated its newly acquired capability to release nuclear energy in an uncontrolled fashion. What Kenneth Bainbridge didn't know, standing in that bunker 16 kilometers from ground zero, his hands trembling as he held the telephone receiver, was that the device he had just tested would prove to be one of the smallest atomic weapons ever deployed. The 20 kiloton yield that seemed so staggering in 1945 would be dwarfed by hydrogen bombs measuring their yields in megatons, millions of tons of TNT equivalent. The gadget that required years of effort by thousands of scientists would be superseded by weapons small enough to fit in an artillery shell, portable enough to be carried by a single soldier. The transformation Trinity represented, from conventional to nuclear warfare, from industrial-age weapons to atomic-age weapons, would itself be transformed. What seemed to the witnesses like an endpoint, a weapon so powerful that it transcended previous categories, was actually a beginning. The question that haunted the Trinity observers, whether humanity could control such power, would only become more urgent as weapons grew more powerful, more numerous, and more widely distributed among nations with competing interests and conflicting ideologies. On the 75th anniversary of Trinity, in July 2020, the test site remained closed to most visitors except for twice-yearly open house events. The crater had long since been filled and bulldozed. Most of the trinitite had been removed. Radiation levels, while still elevated, were deemed safe for brief visits. A stone monument marked the location, inscribed with the date and a simple description of what had occurred. A visitor, reading the inscription, asked the National Park Service guide a question. "Why here? Why this particular spot in the desert?" The guide's answer captured something essential about Trinity's significance. They chose this location because it was remote enough to keep the tests secret, far enough from civilization to provide a safety buffer, and empty enough that no one would be harmed. They were right about keeping it secret, right about the buffer, right that no one was immediately harmed. What they couldn't know is that there was no place truly remote enough, no distance truly safe enough, no way to confine the implications of what they were about to discover. The crater is 300 meters wide, but the blast wave circled the Earth, and we're still feeling its effects 3/4 of a century later. The light that came at 5:29 on that July morning in 1945, brighter than 1,000 suns, illuminating the desert with impossible radiance, had revealed not just the power of atomic fission, but the fundamental transformation in humanity's relationship with physical reality. For the first time in history, human beings possessed energy sources comparable to natural phenomena, could create temperatures existing only in stars, could release in seconds the accumulated energy of millions of years of geological time. The question that haunted the Trinity observers, the question that Kenneth Bainbridge captured in his profane first reaction, was not whether the bomb worked. It had worked magnificently, exceeding most predictions, demonstrating that theoretical physics could be transformed into devastating practice. The question was whether humanity, having gained such power, possessed sufficient wisdom to control it. 3/4 of a century later, that question remains unanswered, and the light from Trinity continues to cast its long shadow across every subsequent generation's struggle to live with the knowledge that we can, if we choose, end our own civilization in an afternoon. History would judge the Trinity test not as an ending, but as a threshold, not as a solution, but as a question posed to every generation that followed. What will you do with such power? How will you choose? The scientists who stood in those bunkers, watching the mushroom cloud rise toward the stratosphere, could not have fully comprehended that they were witnessing not the culmination of the atomic age, but its commencement, not the mastery of nuclear forces, but the beginning of humanity's long and uncertain struggle to live with powers that, in earlier ages, would have been considered the prerogative of gods alone. The desert sand, fused into green glass by temperatures beyond natural occurrence on Earth's surface, remained as testament. The witnesses, their lives forever marked by what they had seen, carried the weight of that knowledge until death. The world, learning of atomic weapons through their use against cities, could never unlearn what Trinity had revealed. And the light, that impossible, terrible, magnificent light, once seen, could never be forgotten, would shine in memory and in consequence across all the decades and centuries to come, illuminating not just that moment in the New Mexico desert, but the entire uncertain future of a species that had learned to split the atom before learning to live in peace with itself.